20,000 pages just dropped in Washington, and trust me, you're going to want to hear what's in them. We're talking about explosive revelations that touched the highest office in the land, a government shutdown that just shattered records, and a market meltdown that's making investors sweat. This isn't your usual news cycle. This is the kind of day that rewrites narratives. I spent years inside one of the biggest media operations you can name, watching stories get bent and twisted to protect the powerful. I walked away from that world because I couldn't stomach it anymore. Now I work for myself, I answer to nobody, and I'm going to tell you exactly what's happening without the spin. And listen, if you value that kind of honesty, if you're tired of being fed sanitized versions of reality, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and if you really want to support independent journalism that doesn't bow to corporate interests, consider becoming a channel sponsor. It makes a real difference, and it keeps this operation running without compromises. So let's get into it, because what just came out of the House Oversight Committee is absolutely staggering. We're talking about 20,000 pages of documents tied to Jeffrey Epstein's estate. 20,000. And this isn't just some data dump that'll gather dust. This is material that's already sending shockwaves through the political establishment and dragging some very prominent names back into the spotlight in ways they definitely didn't want. Here's what's grabbing everyone's attention. Among these newly released documents are emails, private communications between Epstein and his associates, and some of them reference President Donald Trump directly, and I mean directly. According to what's now public, Epstein didn't exactly speak highly of Trump in private. In fact, he reportedly called him evil beyond belief, described him as a maniac, and even suggested he was showing signs of early dementia. Those are Epstein's words, not mine, but they're now part of the public record, and they're explosive. But it gets more specific, and this is where things really heat up. In these private exchanges, Epstein allegedly boasted about what he claimed to have on Trump. He stated that Trump knew about the girls, a phrase that obviously carries enormous implications, and suggested he held some kind of leverage or compromising information. Now, whether that's true, whether Epstein was exaggerating, or whether this was just talk between associates, we don't know for certain. But the fact that it's now documented and released by a congressional committee means it's going to fuel intense speculation and renewed investigations. The White House response was immediate and predictable. They dismissed the entire release as a Democratic smear campaign, insisting that nothing in these 20,000 pages actually proves any wrongdoing by Trump. They're calling it a selective leak, timed for maximum political damage, and they're pushing back hard on the narrative that this somehow implicates the president in anything criminal or unethical. That's their position, and they're sticking to it. Meanwhile, Republicans in Congress didn't just sit back and take it. They responded with their own counter-release, making sure the full 20,000-page cache got out there, which, interestingly enough, includes frequent mentions of Trump, mostly tied to his political activities and allegations involving his social circles. So both sides are now playing this game of controlling the narrative, releasing material, spinning context, and trying to shape how the public interprets this massive document dump. And here's the timing that makes this even more politically charged. This release comes just as the House is preparing to vote on something called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. If that measure passes, it would force the release of all government records tied to Epstein, not just this batch, but everything. So this isn't just about scandal. This is about whether the public is going to get access to a complete accounting of who was involved with Epstein, what they knew, and what they did. The stakes couldn't be higher. This isn't just gossip or tabloid material. This is a political earthquake. Both parties are now locked in a battle to control how this story unfolds, and the public is left sifting through a dense web of relationships, allegations, and secrets that go back decades. The fact that Epstein's private communications are now public record means we're going to see a lot more scrutiny, a lot more questions, and probably a lot more political fallout in the weeks ahead. Now, if you think that's intense, buckle up, because there's more. The United States government just went through the longest shutdown in its entire history, 43 days. Let that sink in. For over a month, the federal government was essentially paralyzed, and the consequences were devastating. This shutdown started at the beginning of October, and it left more than 1.4 million federal workers without paychecks. We're talking about people who couldn't pay rent, couldn't buy groceries, couldn't plan for the future because their government employer just stopped functioning. Public services ground to a halt, frustration boiled over on both sides of the aisle, and the political blame game reached fever pitch. President Trump finally signed a bill to reopen the government after Congress managed to hammer out a deal. It took a tense vote, with key Senate Democrats joining Republicans to approve a temporary funding measure, but they got it done. This agreement keeps the government funded until January 30th, and it includes specific appropriations for the military, the legislative branch, and the Department of Agriculture. Notably, it sidesteps some of the sharper spending cuts that had been on the table during negotiations, which tells you just how desperate both sides were to end this standoff. The political finger-pointing during those 43 days was relentless. Trump blamed Democrats for obstructing funding. Democrats blamed Trump for refusing to negotiate in good faith, and polling data showed that the public was angry at everyone involved. Nobody came out of this looking good, and the damage to trust in government institutions is real and measurable. Here's something that should raise eyebrows. During the shutdown, the private sector actually stepped in at certain points. A donor reportedly covered military pay, which sounds generous on the surface, but think about the implications. When private citizens have to fund the military because the government can't get its act together, that raises serious ethical questions about who's really in charge and what happens when public functions get outsourced to private interests. It's a precedent that should make everyone uncomfortable. So that's two massive stories, but we're not done yet, because while Washington is dealing with scandals and shutdowns, Wall Street is watching a different kind of crisis unfold. Artificial intelligence stocks are in freefall, and the companies that were supposed to be the untouchable darlings of the tech world are suddenly looking very vulnerable. We're seeing sharp declines across the board. Nvidia dropped 3.6%, Supermicrocomputer fell 7.4%, Palantir was down 6.5%, and Broadcom lost over 4%. These aren't small companies, these are giants, and when they fall, they drag the entire market with them. The Nasdaq, which is packed with tech stocks, dropped 2.3% in a single session on Thursday. That's a serious correction, and it's making investors nervous. What's driving this? Well, for months now, money has been pouring into AI companies at a pace that reminded some analysts of the late 90s. .com bubble valuations skyrocketed, expectations went through the roof, and everyone wanted in on the next big thing. But now, reality is starting to bite. Analysts at Goldman Sachs and other major firms are sounding alarms. They're pointing out that equity valuations look dangerously inflated, that capital outlays are at historic highs, and that the jobs market is showing fragility, just as these companies are spending billions on infrastructure and development. The comparison to the dot-com crash is becoming impossible to ignore, and investors are starting to ask hard questions about whether the revenue growth actually justifies the massive bets being placed on AI. This is momentum trading colliding with fundamental analysis, and when that happens, markets correct, sometimes brutally. Even the most hyped, most celebrated companies aren't immune to the laws of economics. If the profits don't materialize, if the growth doesn't meet expectations, the stock prices will adjust, and that's exactly what we're seeing right now. Before I wrap this up, let me just recap what we've covered today, because these aren't isolated incidents, they're all connected threads in a bigger picture. We've got 20,000 pages of Epstein documents dropping, pulling Trump and others back into a scandal that was never fully resolved. We've got a 43-day government shutdown that just ended, the longest in history, leaving over 1 million workers without pay and exposing deep dysfunction in Washington. And we've got AI stocks cratering as the market wakes up to the reality that hype doesn't pay bills and inflated valuations eventually collapse. This is the state of play right now. Power struggles, financial volatility, and scandals that refuse to die, all happening at the same time. And here's the thing, this is just the beginning. These stories are going to unfold over the coming weeks and months, and I'm going to be here breaking them down for you, cutting through the noise, and giving you the analysis you're not going to get from the mainstream outlets. So if you found this valuable, if this kind of independent reporting matters to you, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. And seriously, if you want to help keep this channel running without corporate sponsorship or editorial interference, consider becoming a channel sponsor. It's personal support that makes real journalism possible, and I'm grateful for every single person who steps up. Stay sharp, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.